Hi, welcome to Off Chain. Today we have a very special guest, Eric Lombrozo, who is one of the main people behind Segwit, one of the people that's very prominent in the community. He's also CEO of Cyphex, and he obviously contributes to Bitcoin Core quite a bit. He talks about Bitcoin quite a bit in a lot of places, including here. Welcome, Eric.
Hi, Jimmy. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah. Let's start with something pretty simple. When you first heard about Bitcoin, what was that like? What did you think of it?
Well, the first time I heard of it, I think, was on some chat. I was in some random chat online, and some people were talking about it, and I thought, I didn't really know what it was. But then it wasn't until later on that actually one of my friends told me more about it, and I kind of started researching it, and then I kind of got hooked on it. And I thought it was probably the most interesting internet application that I had seen in a very long time. So I got hooked in and addicted, just like everyone else, I guess. Yeah, so.
What year was this? When was that?
This was around 2011. Yeah,
Wow.
2011.
Okay, and you got it right away. Did you have to read the white paper multiple times, or was it just something that you got?
Well, the white paper actually was pretty clear. I thought it was pretty well described, but just kind of like grasping the concepts and mulling it over. Maybe like I spent like probably at least a week until I actually started trying to write some code. And I had to go through the whole the documentation for the protocol and all that kind of stuff. So, but yeah, I mean, it pretty quickly I realized that it was something that was really interesting and novel, and yeah, so.
Okay, and did you get into core development pretty early? What was that? How was that done?
Well, I first, I was using Bitcoin Core because that was just the reference client, and so, but I was trying to build applications on top of the RPC on Bitcoin Core, and I quickly realized that it had some pretty serious limitations, and particularly like with the wallet, I just like the API was just too limited to do the kind of stuff that I wanted to do. So I started to dig around more in the actual code base and to looking more at the protocol documentation, and I guess I started to hang out in the IRC chats and that kind of stuff, and it took a little while until I actually started to have some commits in the project and to start getting more involved. But I think that I got along pretty quickly, pretty well with most of the core developers, and it was it was a very humbling experience. I learned so much, and there's still so much that I don't know about Bitcoin, and it's just like after all these years, all these discussions that have gone on, and but yeah, I think it's been a definitely if to really get down into the to really understand the protocol at a basic level, it was just a necessary step to really get in there and talk to these guys directly and start contributing. So yeah.
What was your first pull request?
I think the first thing that I worked on was a multi-wallet thing that I wanted to do, which actually I kind of shelved for a little while, and then Luke Jr. actually picked that up later, and then it actually got added, which is kind of nice. But yeah,
0.15, I think, right? Like multi-wallet.
Now it's just yeah. So basically, that was something that I had actually my first experience with trying to contribute to core, because I actually didn't come from an open source background. I came from a more of a commercial enterprise software background, working in a few different startups before, and so open source was kind of like a new thing, and I actually learned the whole open source thing to a large extent from working on Bitcoin Core. My first attempt at trying to contribute, I actually ended up implementing this whole multi-wallet thing with everything, bells and whistles, and a million things that it was beautiful. And then I tried to submit a pull request, and it's like, first of all, who's going to review all that crap, right? And then second of all, it's like it's so much stuff to add at once, and I quickly learned that that's just probably not the best way to do open source development. I realized that I had to kind of maybe like reduce my commits to smaller to less ambitious things at one step at a time. And then the second thing I tried to do was to kind of re-architect things a little bit, or to do a little bit of a code cleanup, and that was also a big learning experience because I love software architecture. That's kind of like my passion in software, and I really wanted to kind of redo everything. And I think a lot of contributors kind of had that experience initially. They come in and they try to fix all these things, and I want to do it this way because it's beautiful. And then you realize that you have to kind of work with everyone else, and that there's just like there's all these different bottlenecks in the process that you just have to deal with just because of the nature of it. Just it's such a security, the security requirements of this are so critical that review is so necessary for all this stuff. It was I had to learn a different style of coding where, I really just reduced my ambitions. And I think, one step at a time, okay, what's the simplest thing that I can get merged that will get me to where I want to get to? It's just the simplest thing to review. And also, reviewing other people's code. And because, it's just like, it's kind of like, I think that it's in any kind of project like this, you can't just implement stuff. That's like the fun part that everyone wants to do, right? You also have to review other people's code and test stuff, and kind of get into these discussions, on GitHub, and try to dig in a little more, so that then people actually want to review your code, right? So that was part of the process. And so it was even if I had like the most beautiful, elegant solution in my mind, it's like, okay, how can I get this merged? Well, it turns out that now if I try to if I try to submit a pull request, within a few days I have to rebase this thing, and it's like a nightmare, right? So I quickly realized that was just not the way. So, but I learned over time. I think I've gotten a little bit better at it, but
and you mentioned something about like how review and testing are so critical, and I that's one of the things I greatly admire about Greg Maxwell is he just like reviews and tests and like analyzes everything at such a micro level. So a question that's
I just want to say about that really quick. I really like what Greg Maxwell or like Peter Willie or like Vladimir do for the project. It's just incredible. Just like the dedication that they have for this, and going through all these pull requests and reviewing all this stuff, and it's stuff that like I prefer not to do myself, and I'm so glad that these guys do it, and they do such a great job of it. So it's like they're amazing at it. They're amazing at it. So it's like I don't care like what else they do. It's like people can criticize them for whatever. It's just the fact that they're doing that is so valuable that it's just like I can't, it's so appreciated by everyone that contributes to the project.
So one of the questions that people are asking in chat is sort of how do you become a core developer? What advice would you give to somebody that's like trying to get into this? Like, how would you coach them to contribute?
Well, you probably want to do a little bit of research and like look up some of the resources and learn some stuff on your own. You don't want to come in there just like totally empty-handed and like not know anything at all, right? Unfortunately, there aren't too many like there is some documentation out there, but it's still something that it's not like everything is perfectly spelled out. So obviously you're going to probably have some questions about some things. I would suggest, joining the IRC chat channels and the mailing list, subscribing to the mailing list. Those are the places where most of the conversation about proposals or ideas takes place. And obviously GitHub, obviously you need to have a GitHub account, and you probably should clone the repo and, tinker with it a little bit. I think, one thing I would say to anyone that wants to contribute to Bitcoin Core is just expect your ideas to get shot down pretty badly in the beginning. They're just, you're just gonna get torn down. If you want to say, we already tried this like 3 years ago, and we realized that it doesn't work for this whatever reason, and it's like you just have to not take it personally. It's hard sometimes, but that's just the way it is.
Yeah, that's great advice. Just sort of not take it personally and don't have too much of an ego.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. I want to go off on that a little bit. What are some challenges facing Bitcoin today? Anything in particular that you feel is a big challenge for the community?
Well, when Bitcoin first started, Bitcoin really kind of had this, it was the only real, blockchain that people really took seriously. And then suddenly you started to have more I can't talk.
Proliferation.
Yes, thank you. There you go. Of different, code forks, and so different alts started to be created. There was Namecoin, and then there was a whole bunch of others. And obviously Litecoin was a big one that happened. And, it's probably one of the bigger ones that has achieved a substantial market cap. But I think, this whole concept of having multiple blockchains and like, consensus rules, like the way that, the different people like have different ideas for how that should go, and resolving those issues is really kind of one of the big problems that I see, and another one is the centralization issues, and whether the incentives are kept in, the checks and balances of the system. So I think that, for instance, miners create blockchains, but then users have to verify the blockchains, and developers have to kind of make sure that the code does what people think it's supposed to do, right? And so keep everyone in consensus and make sure that the network doesn't fragment and stuff like that. Just all these different challenges and making sure that the incentives align. I think that that's really the key. I think that that's really the fundamental feature of Bitcoin, and I think what proof of work really brought to the table was this idea that a network can kind of bootstrap itself with its own incentive structure without requiring external management or external design and coordination in a way. It's like, I mean, obviously there are projects within this that require that, but overall it seems like the incentives, as long as they are aligned, then we can do that. But right now I think that there's a lot of different interests at play, and obviously as Bitcoin becomes more valuable, or different blockchains become more valuable, the stakes get higher, and people have more, there could be divergences of interests, and managing that, I think, is very super important. I think that it's just something that has been really difficult, because Bitcoin was kind of intended to be somewhat apolitical, right? It's like this set of rules that are established from the get-go, and we just kind of accept that these are the rules, and they're not going to change. As soon as you try to change the rules, it becomes political, because different people are going to want different things, and how do you decide which way to go? I think that there's been a lot of progress in understanding some of these issues, but I think that it's in some ways hard to explain to a lot of people how complicated, how difficult it is to do this, and how unique in a lot of ways this is to Bitcoin.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of which, I mean, you were part of one of the biggest changes in recent memory, which is SegWit. It's an enormous change in many ways, not just like in a code way, but socially and all this other ways. So one of the questions I think somebody from chat asked is, what was that like? What was making this whole, what was it like from the beginning, right? Like from idea to implementation and getting it on the network? What was that whole process like, and how did you manage to get something this big in?
Well, I think Aaron wrote a wonderful article. It's on Bitcoin Magazine, and I think that he covers the history actually extremely well of how it went. So anyone that wants to actually read that, I highly recommend them reading that if they want to get a bit of a background. But basically, this idea of the problem of transaction malleability is something that had been a problem since the early days, but it wasn't something that really was like a deal killer completely. It was something that we could work around to a large extent, because basically wallets just had to know that maybe the transaction ID would change, but it would still be the same coins moving from the same place to the same place. And so it didn't really have much of an effect on using the network in that way. But the idea of having like payment channels or a second layer, or additional layers on top of the Bitcoin protocol, quickly made it apparent that having this transaction malleability problem made all these things very, very difficult to actually do. So that meant that a lot of ideas had been kind of tossed out to how to solve that problem. And at the time, I was actually working on my company's stuff. I was working on building Cypherex, and we developed a multi-sig wallet and an app development stack. And I was actually mostly focused on just finding ways to really secure Bitcoins very well, and to be able to manage keys and all that kind of stuff. But then this whole block size thing came into the picture, and like all of a sudden things got really political, right? If that's an understatement. And so I think really there was this big concern about how to actually make protocol changes at the consensus layer. There had been already several soft forks done, and I think in the early days, Satoshi had done a few soft forks, and actually like there were some releases, some consensus rule changes that were very kind of ugly by today's standards in terms of just the coordination effort that would be required. I think it'd be impossible to do that these days. Back then the network was tiny, so it was much easier. Nobody really cared because it wasn't worth that much. But so like these two kind of issues kind of came to a head. Like, one is the scaling thing. How do we actually scale the network? And the other one is, how do we change consensus rules? And just a little bit, like I guess in spring of 2015, the Lightning white paper came out, right? And so this was kind of the first glimpse of maybe some hope of, hey, maybe we can actually do some exponential scaling here. Maybe there is like this kind of like out of the box idea that will allow us to actually grow this thing much more. And at the same time, there was this whole idea of growing the block size. When Satoshi was the one that actually put the 1 megabyte block size limit initially in the code, but unfortunately he left without really telling any of us how to get rid of it without causing serious problems, right? And so just kind of like the confluence of this, trying to like figure out a solution to both of these problems, and SegWit just kind of miraculously appeared, almost like, as like when Luke Jr. actually just kind of like totally just he said that it could be done as a soft fork, just like a matter of fact kind of thing. Oh yeah, of course it could be done as a soft fork. I was like, are you sure? And like even like Greg Maxwell and like Peter were like, no, you can't do it. You need a hard fork for that, right? And it's like, no, but you could actually do this as a soft fork, and this would actually allow us to increase block size and also solve the malleability problem, and also have the ability to add new script types. So this was kind of like a win for everyone. I thought, wow, we solved all this. Unfortunately, at the time, I didn't realize just how like deep some of the undercurrents were as far as like communication issues, especially with this between the open source community and like some of the more like some of the industry. So I realized that, and obviously there was a big battle after that, just because a lot of different interests at play, big stakes, and I think that but yeah, it was definitely a very humbling experience. I would say that the last 2 years of my life have been pretty much focused on this, like almost full time. It's been kind of like the thing. I was so excited when SegWit actually activated, because it was kind of like finishing a marathon, right? Yeah. So, but yeah, it was definitely a huge team effort. A lot of people contributed ideas, and I think Peter Willie ended up coding most of it, and making like the formal proposal. But I think it was a really large team effort, and I think that we really learned a lot about what's actually possible, and practical to deploy on the Bitcoin network, and what kinds of issues might arise from that. So yeah, it is definitely something that I'm glad it's over now, because I kind of want to focus on building like other applications on top of it now, and not to focus as much on all the drama and all this kind of stuff that's been going on. I started as an engineer in this, and I kind of had to like divert some of my attention to other stuff to deal with some issues, and I kind of want to go back to building good products and finding good people to work on cool things. And yeah, it's SegWit's been an amazing experience. It's been it definitely I wouldn't really change anything if I were to go back, even though obviously like there were some points where it was very stressful. I'd say that overall it was an amazing learning experience.
Yeah. So I'm hearing a lot of hard work over 2 years. That's all it takes for SegWit.
Yeah, no, if people only knew how much it's just like crazy how much really effort went into this, and how this solution kind of appeared between like we had the scaling conference in Montreal, and at that time Lightning was being touted as kind of like this idea that maybe we could make this work, but then the transaction malleability problem was still there, and people were still worried about block size and how we were going to fix that, and SegWit just kind of like came out of the blue as like, hey, it solves these two things, but it took a while until I think really the significance of it started to become appreciated, and still I think that we still have yet to see the actual results. I strongly believe that we're going to see some massive transformations in the entire ecosystem as a result, but obviously it's not something that just happens overnight. So yeah, it's definitely something which I'm really glad that that we're able to now build these kinds of things on top of it.
Yeah. So what are you excited about? What do you think SegWit makes possible going forward? What are you working on? What are you excited about? What do you think will happen in the near future with Bitcoin?
Well, I mean, I'm really excited about having like the Lightning Network and second layer stuff in particular. I feel that that's really the only solution that seems viable right now to make a payment industry actually viable. It just I mean, just the way that Bitcoin works, on-chain fees are going to keep increasing just as more demand goes up and as the price goes higher. As a proof of the storage, I mean, as a store of value kind of thing, I think that for that particular use case, it's very, very good still. I think that it's an uncorrelated asset, and it seems to be holding its value pretty well. But as a payment system, definitely the Bitcoin network has some severe problems. And I don't think that anyone really is to blame for this. I just think that it's just the nature of the system's design. Even like people, early contributors like Hal Finney, for instance, talked about how at some point it was going to be needed, it was going to be necessary to have these hubs that could process off-chain payments to be able to scale this. And Satoshi even talked in the white paper of the possibility of eventually miners being more concentrated, or more having not necessarily everyone running a full node, but a lot of the problems around that were not really solved at the time. I think that it was just too early to know whether the idea was going to work in the first place to really try to solve everything, right? So yeah, I think it's absolutely critical to build a multi-layer kind of architecture. I think that that's just the way that that we scale networks nowadays. That's the way that the internet works. So it makes sense to apply those kind of same concepts to Bitcoin. So I'm really, really excited that now we can actually start working on these second layer or multi-layer solutions to these things. I don't think that everyone knows exactly how it's going to work out completely, but I think that a lot of people are very optimistic that we'll actually be able to find some very interesting use cases that are just not possible without that.
And what are you personally working on? What projects are you like? You mentioned that you're an engineer and you want to get back to sort of making stuff. What are you working on now?
Well, I mean, I'm working on still, building my company and trying to, get more involved with other projects. Particularly, there's a lot of the small open source projects that I think are just fascinating. I mean, I think all the Lightning, stuff that people are working on, as far as like the daemons themselves, and also like in the wallet space, like the Zap wallet by Jack Mallers, for instance, that's like a really interesting thing that I probably want to look more into and try to see how we can actually build an application stack that can actually support application development, where we can bring on more people to contribute, and bring them up to speed so that they're productive quickly at the application layer without having to dig down into like the deepest levels of the protocol. And I think that right now it's still, it's still not there, but that's kind of what I'm working on right now.
Okay, all right, so cool. So you want to make Lightning more accessible to the people, it sounds like.
Yeah, and whatever other kinds of multi-layer solutions come out. I think that the Lightning Network really is kind of this broad name that was given to. I mean, the fundamental concept here is bidirectional routable payment channels. So being able to route payments and being able to have bidirectional payment channels. It really, but there's other things that can be done with second layers, such as atomic swaps between different chains, Tumblebit, for instance, and these other kinds of things. So there's a lot of really interesting stuff that can be built as protocols that sit atop of Bitcoin. So all that stuff is very fascinating right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's something that you think is coming up next after? I mean, obviously we got all of these things that are going to build on top of SegWit, but what other things are sort of coming down the pike for Bitcoin Core, do you think, coming up?
Well, I see Bitcoin Core as kind of the node software itself, really the consensus rules and validation and relay are kind of like its main functions, right? Other stuff like the wallet, or at one point it even did mining, right? But that part was eventually taken out just because, So, but I mean, I think that the really validation and relay are the key features of Bitcoin Core. And so I would kind of think that in a way it's kind of, I would like to see it, like it's kind of funny to say, but I would like to see Bitcoin Core become more of a boring project in the sense that it doesn't need to change so much, right? It's more of a stable kind of thing that maybe people, it needs to be maintained, obviously, but it becomes more of a maintenance job, less of just adding a whole bunch of new features to that. I think there's a lot, but there is a lot of very, very interesting stuff that's coming down the pipe as far as consensus ideas for, like, for instance, adding new signature types, signature schemes, new opcodes or scripts that can do more interesting smart contracts and stuff like that. So Merkleized abstract syntax trees and Schnorr signatures, and so I think that stuff is also really fascinating. Fungibility is going to be a key issue that I think needs to be tackled, and so all these things, I think that those kinds of things might require some changes at the consensus layer. But I'm actually really kind of relieved that we can start doing some protocol development that doesn't require consensus changes, so we can be more creative and just experiment and try wild stuff and not have to get everyone to agree. We can kind of decide, hey, like, I'm going to try this out, and it's more of like a sandbox where you can do whatever you want and fully opt in kind of thing. So it's kind of like I think that Bitcoin Core is going to continue being, I think that most of the most experienced protocol developers have contributed or actively contribute to that project. So I think that there's a lot of knowledge and wisdom as far as a lot of these things there, as far as like what's possible to do and how viable and different deployment mechanisms and strategies and stuff like that. So I think that that's more kind of, and optimization I think is also a big thing. Just making it run faster and being able to do things more efficiently. But as far as like the architecture of the network, I would really like to see that layer kind of stabilize a little bit and see more of the innovation happen at higher levels.
Yeah. So looking back a little bit, great answer, by the way. I think all of those things are true. I would love for Bitcoin Core to be a little more boring. We've had enough drama, right? That said, so looking back at SegWit and like what it took to activate it, was there anything that supporters could have done to make it better? This is a question from David Harding, whom I'm sure you're very familiar with.
Yes, I know him pretty well. Yeah, of course, there's things that we could have done better. And actually, David Harding contributed a lot to getting the message out and educating people on stuff and making great posts about it. I think I didn't really realize just how big of a communication gap there was in early 2015. It became quite apparent by the end of 2015 that there was obviously a problem, right? But I think definitely just trying to bridge that communication gap and trying to have better, ways of getting people to, getting everyone kind of to understand like really what the implications of all these things were, and to kind of get more feedback and understand what some of the concerns like from some people in the industry might have been, or like what some of the motivations were for different things. Yeah, so unfortunately I think that there was a lot of friction in that, but at the same time I kind of feel like that experience it's kind of like building up an immune system. I've used this analogy a million times already. I think the system kind of needs to learn how to adapt to these kinds of things, and it's going to be a little chaotic at times. It's just the nature of it. In fact, I think that if it wasn't very chaotic, if it was like all very, very well structured, then I'd be worried that maybe it's getting a little too centralized. You know what I mean? So so yeah, obviously, like in hindsight, there's a lot of stuff that we could have done much better. But I think that we did the best we could.
And what lessons do you think that we should apply for sort of like the next thing? I know you're talking about sort of core being boring, but we do have like 2x coming up and all these other things. Like, how would you sort of approach it differently from based on what you learned with SegWit?
This is not the first time that we've been faced with a potential hard fork, and it's being pushed by people that not all of them are exactly friendly to all core developers. I think that at first when the idea of a hard fork was pushed and people kind of started to get polarized, a lot of people got really scared that, well, hey, the network's going to fragment, we're going to get a chain split and all these other issues, and how are we going to deal with that? But we've already had that happen now, and I think and we've already seen several proposals that actually never made it through. There's been several attempts at this that just never actually went ahead and did it. I think BCH is the first major attempt at this, actually went ahead and did it. I personally, my personal feeling is, I mean, I don't think that really we can stop people from doing that, and I think that it's just part of the dynamics of the system. If the incentives align for people to try to do that stuff, and I think that in some cases they do, especially like for speculation purposes and trying to accumulate more bitcoins. I think that some people see these as opportunities to kind of increase their Bitcoin holdings without having to buy at current market prices, right? But as far as like network cohesion and like brand, keeping the brand together, and just the complexity of like and just onboarding new users and stuff like that. If we have like these chain splits happening all the time, I think it's kind of a nightmare. It's very much it's very hard to explain to people what Bitcoin is just with one blockchain, right? And if we have to deal with like multiple different blockchains and different asset types that all are kind of Bitcoin in some way or another, like it gets kind of difficult to do that. I don't think that really helps the overall cohesion. I think that it kind of it tends to split efforts in the community. It doesn't I think that it'd be better to innovate if we can kind of like have a stable base upon which stuff can happen. But having said that, none of us have any control over that. I personally think that if people want to try something very different that maybe is like a different value proposition, like what was done with, say, like Ripple or Ethereum or other projects that I also contributed to in the early in the beginning, I think that that's fine. I don't think that when I got into Bitcoin, I didn't think that this was going to be the end all be all. I actually thought it was more of kind of like a prototype. So if you have something that really has a very different value proposition, and you want to launch a different chain that has very, very different features, and just like see like what the markets decide, I don't discourage that. With SegWit 2x though, I just feel like a bump to like just doubling the it seems like a tiny increase in throughput with like all this other risk associated with it, and splitting the chain. And I mean, yeah, obviously for speculators and for some exchanges and stuff like that, I think it could be definitely something that would improve their bottom line in some ways. But I think that for the ecosystem as a whole, especially if we want to make this a viable payment network and onboard new users and kind of reach mass adoption, I don't think that kind of stuff really helps. So my concern is I just don't think that SegWit 2x really offers a value proposition that is really that substantially different, that it merits this kind of division and potential complexities that are going to I think it's going to probably affect the Bitcoin price negatively in some ways, especially like if people at first, eventually maybe it won't, but definitely there's going to be some scare from this. I don't know if that's really, I'd rather not see that kind of stuff happen. But then again, it's just like we just have to plan for it and prepare for it, and if people decide that they want to still go ahead and do it, despite all this advice that I've tried to give them about it, it's what can I do, right? So.
All right. So Eric, so this is a question also from Twitter. What would it take for you to support something like 2x? Would like a year prep time? Would like maybe going through the core development process, getting it vetted? Like what would it take for you to support something like that?
Well, Russell just posted a few, made a few blog posts recently. It's like a 3-part series, and I think that there's a lot of really great ideas there. I think that really there's been a lot of discussion about these ideas of how to actually do a safe hard fork, what it requires to actually build consensus for one, what kind of features we would want to see in one. I think that there's a lot of there's this long hard fork wish list that has been around, and it's just been growing. People say, hey, what if we could do this thing, and what if we could do that thing? I think one of the most amazing discoveries of 2015 though was that we could actually get a lot done just with soft forks alone. Which if we could build consensus in the community, at least the deployment issues would not be that big of a problem. Obviously, if it's contentious, then it's still a problem. But I think that I would like to see more, just patient, steady work, really trying to plan for the long term, and to not rush things or do things that are reckless or that that don't really have much peer review, and that haven't been really vetted. So I would definitely like to see these ideas vetted more, and I'd like to see the open source ethos still continue to apply, where all these things are reviewed in the open and public, and people can comment on them, and really have everyone kind of go at it and see if it's actually a viable proposal or not. I don't feel that SegWit 2x was done that way. I feel it was kind of people just kind of deciding that that's what they were going to do, like just and kind of impose it on the community. And I don't like that dynamic, just because I feel like if a few companies can get together and kind of change the protocol, change the rules of the protocol like that, well, governments are going to have an even easier time to do that later, right? So basically, I think the whole value proposition of Bitcoin dies if we go down that path.
What would have been the right way for them to go about it? What would have been like your preferred way for them to bring it up, or how could they have done this better?
Well, I think just maybe it's just like the difference of culture between like the more corporate culture and the open source culture. And I've been in both worlds a little bit, so I think I've kind of understand how both of them work to some extent. But I think that there's just a huge communication gap there. I think that the scaling conferences that were held, for instance, were a good thing that was done. Obviously it wasn't perfect. We're all still learning how to do this kind of stuff, right? But I think having a public vetting process and being able to submit proposals and have them reviewed, and get feedback from people that are top experts in this kind of stuff. And I think there's there aren't too many people in the world that have tons of experience in this, but there are a few. And I think that those people's opinions are very important in this. A lot of times there might be some very subtle issue that a lot of people just don't see in it. It's like, yeah, this should work, no problem, right? Well, it turns out that no, there's a big problem because it causes this other thing, And so I think that those opinions need to be respected. I'm not saying that I always agree with all the different protocol experts and everything. I think that everyone sometimes is wrong about certain things, but I definitely think that it's important to hear people's opinions and to really kind of know what to get a better sense for what's actually practical and what can be done. And I feel like in this case, I mean, it was just this. A lot of us got asked our opinions about stuff, but then in the end, it's like they still went ahead and did it completely contrary to a lot of the advice that we gave, without really accepting more input or allowing us to say, hey, well, maybe you should do it this other way or whatever. Just kind of like, okay, well, we're just going to do something and we got to do it now. Which, I mean, I understand from a corporate mindset. It's like, yeah, sometimes you have a project that you need to do, and you have deadlines, and you want to get it done, and it feels good to have some goal and some deadline, and yay, we're going to do it, right? And everyone gets on board. But that's just not the way that open source development typically works, and especially for something like Bitcoin. It's just you can't impose your own schedule on certain things. You just have to kind of let certain things grow organically, and sometimes it takes time. And I think it's important to be a little bit patient about this. I strongly believe in the value proposition of Bitcoin, and I think that there's a lot of great stuff that we can do, but it's going to take a while until all these ideas really get fully fleshed out. And it's I think I also have a business, right? And I run a business, and I'm trying to like find a way to find a niche in all this thing. And I just learning to adapt to it. It's not like I can force Bitcoin to be what I need it to be for my business, right? That's just not. It doesn't work that way. You just have to kind of adapt to whatever Bitcoin actually needs, or what how it actually grows organically, and kind of shape your own business around that. So maybe it's just it's just a difference of cultures and like a big communication gap that happened. Yeah, I hope that in the future we can do better at that.
Yeah. And I think what you just said is absolutely right. Bitcoin owes no man their business model, and that's something that I think is very hard for a business person that's sort of relying on Bitcoin to understand. If Barry were to come to you and say, Eric, I was wrong. What can I do to make this all better? I know he's like noted you and all that other stuff that's on Twitter now. But and
it's not personal, by the way. It's not like it's yeah.
It is funny though. The memes are hilarious. Yeah. If he were to come to you and ask you for your advice, what can I do to make everything better, keep Bitcoin unified? What would you tell him?
Well, I would say that it's important that we first open better lines of communication and that we have more involvement of protocol developers actually submitting feedback and getting feedback from industry, and to kind of maybe filter out more of the noise, because there's a lot of people out there just making a lot of noise about stuff, and maybe sometimes it's hard to really pick up the signal from all that. I think we need to get better at that. Not all voices. I mean, I think everyone has the right to speak their minds, but not all opinions are the same, right? It's like some opinions are probably more informed than others, and it's good to be able to figure out which of those signals are actually more meaningful. And so I would first do that. I think that's the first step before we talk about any kind of contentious, hard forks or anything like that. I think that really that needs to be solved. Once we address that, I really like what people like Rusty or like Johnson Lau have worked on some ideas for how we might be able to actually deploy a hard fork in the future. With community consensus. It might still lead to a chain split, but at least I think that we might be able to build considerably more consensus behind it and not let it be as divisive as this. And I think that it's yeah, really there's some really good ideas for how to actually do all these things. It's just that they're not things you can just snap your fingers and say, okay, well, in 2 months or 3 months, we're going to get this done, or in 6 months even. I think that a lot of this stuff is going to take a little bit longer. Just just first breaking the communication gap. That takes a while, and then looking at the potential solutions and proposals and vetting them and trying to see, what's actually viable. And so if we really wanted to keep Bitcoin unified, I think that that's just necessary. Otherwise, it's just, this is not me like saying, well, like I'm just going to be obstinate and like, not go that way. It's just, that's just the way the network works. I mean, users expect the network to behave a certain way, and a lot of them like don't want certain things to change. And if there's enough users that really don't want some change, it's not possible to really impose it on them. It doesn't, it's just the nature of it. Yeah, it's just I definitely think that the approach is more the problem than the actual proposal. I mean, I'm not saying that I think the 2x proposal is like ideal. I definitely would like to see either dynamic block sizes, or at least like a growth. Because I mean, I just don't think it's viable that every single time that blocks fill up, we're going to like increase the block size with a hard fork, right? It's just that idea just seems ridiculous to me, right? So if we're going to do a hard fork, let's try to add some more stuff into it that we actually know we can do, and also try to get some kind of like growth rate into the so that we don't need to be doing these hard forks all the time. But definitely have a discussion out in the open and get people's figure out what the signal is and who actually knows what they're talking about, and go about it that way.
Would you be in support of something like BIP 103 written by Peter Willa that increases like 17% a year or something like that?
Something like that is reasonable. I think at some point, I think that, probably, I mean, it makes sense that obviously technology improves and, storage space gets cheaper, bandwidth gets higher, CPUs get faster. I mean, even though right now Moore's law is kind of maybe dying out a little bit, but in any case, I think that definitely technology continues to improve. So it doesn't make sense that necessarily like we'd want to just keep the blocks at just, what they are right now. But like what exactly that growth rate should be, or whether it's possible to make it adapt to the network conditions and the demand, or if it's possible to incentivize these kinds of things in better ways. I think there's a lot of work there. I think that one of the things that really excites me about payment channels in particular is that it adds new ways to incentivize maybe different kinds of things on the network, different services where you can have more specialization. Right now, really, the only highly specialized thing that's kind of been pulled out is mining, because that's the only thing that gets directly rewarded by the protocol. So that it's kind of become an industry. Other things are not rewarded. Running a node, for instance, a validating node is not something that you get directly rewarded for. I would like to see if it's possible to incentivize some more of those things. So there, I think that if we were able to do that and also incentivize storage and maybe have a way of distributing the blockchain in a way where it's easier for thin clients to actually be able to pick up compact cryptographic proofs that that can validate their transactions without having to validate the entire blockchain and still have a similar level or the same level of security, that would be ideal. So yeah, for me, I mean, personally, I'm not in a rush. I know that other companies have really tried to push the payment space and tried to really get this adopted at the retail level and stuff like that. I don't want to disappoint people, but I just don't think that the technology is quite ready for that yet. I think that it's going to take a little while until we finally are able to get to that level. But it still works very well as a store of value right now, and I don't want to lose that. I don't want to lose the decentralized store of value, and I think that a lot of other people, a lot of other stakeholders and users in the space feel the same way. So contentious forks that have all these kinds of security risks and things like that are just things that I think a lot of people are very much wary of, and trying to push something like this without building the consensus first, I think is a mistake.
And how long do you think is a reasonable time? What's like a reasonable timeline for a hard fork? It's definitely not 3 months. Is a year enough? Is 2 years enough? What's your view on that?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, I would like to be able to give some time frame, and I know that a lot of businesses want to have time frames so they can kind of plan, their strategy. It's totally understandable. But just being honest about it, I honestly don't really know. I think that there's still a lot of uncertainties in this, and I think just we need to improve communications. That just is like a given. We need to have better communications between the open source community and the industry. And so why don't we take that step first? We know it needs to be done, and so if we do that, then maybe at that point we'll know a little bit better what we can expect.
What would that look like? What would having really good communication, what would that look like? Would that be like roundtables, like meetings, or something out in the open? Like what would that look like?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, all of what you just said. I think it's important to really have open forums where people can participate, and maybe like the IRC chat channels and the Bitcoin dev mailing list are not exactly the place where business people want to hang out in, and some of the more technically oriented ones maybe do, but I think for a lot of people that are interested in the more the business side of things, that's not really the type of places that they hang out in, and so and it's not exactly the type of threads that they like to go through. It's important to be able to summarize like basic concepts and to present them in a way that's understandable at a very high level, so people can make strategic decisions for their companies, right? And so I've been trying to do that myself to some extent. I think that it's kind of hard to bridge these two worlds. I think a lot of engineers tend to get very hyper focused on the details of what they're working on, and a lot of times people that just want a high level overview don't really care about that, right? So it's just, I think having better and having better documentation, I think, is also very important. So that's another thing that I'm working on. And so a lot of people, I think, are trying to build a better library of resources where people can kind of see what's been done. I think a big problem is that a lot of these discussions happen kind of in impromptu chats or like on Reddit or whatever, right? And most of like the really hardcore technical stuff doesn't happen on Reddit at all or anything like that, or on Twitter or anything. I mean, social media is more for like other kinds of things, but there are some ideas that sometimes get discussed in some forums where it's really hard to archive it. And these kinds of social media platforms are all about the now. It's just like what's going on right now and what people care about right now. But to really be able to plan these things, this is more kind of like developing a new discipline, a new science, for instance. And so like in academia, people publish and they cite other works, and they try to there's like librarians and archives and all these kinds of things that happen. People that kind of try to organize and this information in a form that can really be searched. I think that that's really important, and having really communications where we can kind of bridge this kind of culture gap, and maybe avoid some of these kinds of arguments over like little minutia of stuff that maybe doesn't really matter so much for like big decisions that need to be made right now. I think a lot of times people just kind of tend to get into these arguments of proving that they're right about something, and it's something that I used to do a lot too when I was younger. I think it's just something that
you admitted that with open source programming, you just sort of have to lose that ego, and that's something that I think it can be very hard for maybe like a business CEO to be told, no, you can't do that,
Right.
because
Right.
yeah, and that's a hard one to fix.
It is. It is. Yeah. So, I mean, and I'm a company CEO, right? I mean,
Mhm.
I have a small company, but still, I mean, but I kind of like bridge this by, saying, like thinking, well, projects that are done under my company, well, there maybe like, I can have a little more direct influence on, specific things, specific objectives and goals and deadlines and whatever. But when it comes to the open source stuff, I just have to adapt to it. I have to just kind of see how it responds to different things that I do, and if it responds positively, great. And if not, then I have kind of, I accept that I cannot force it to change. I have to adapt to it. I can learn how to maybe influence it in some ways, but I have to kind of work within the constraints of what that allows. And it's just a part of the whole thing. You just have to, it's like laws of physics. There's gravity, and it's just like, if you want to defy that, you're probably not going to do too well, right? I mean, you just have to take that into account when you're making decisions. And it's the same with these kinds of systems, where you have this kind of the thing that kind of grows organically, and it behaves a certain way. It's kind of like an organism that just kind of like runs a certain way. And yeah, I think it's really hard for a lot of people to grasp that, like the idea of like no one being really in control. It's like, scary for some people maybe.
Yeah, it reminds me of something that you and I have talked about in the past, which is that this really is an issue of control. And I think for a lot of people, they think, oh, okay, well, the business people want control, obviously, and the core people want control. But I think what you just described is absolutely right. It's this organic thing that sort of is on its own, and it's sort of taking a life of its own, and you can't really control it. And if you try, what it ends up doing is it kind of splits in two, or does all kinds of weird things that you might not want it to do, and
Right.
you end up killing the baby with the, by trying to feed it too much or something, and that's a hard concept for a lot of CEOs to get it.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, I mean, I hope that we can actually, we can improve some of that. And my interest here is like, to find the best outcome for everyone that's possible. Obviously, there's going to be different interests here, and some people's interests might run counter to mine and some other things. Like obviously, different businesses, compete with each other over different markets, or have different visions of where they want to, take things or whatever. That's totally understandable. But I would like to see, consideration of the constraints, and a better understanding of that at a high level, so that good decisions can be made. I really think that it's important to be able to make good decisions, especially if you're running a business. And so, yeah, it's something which I hope we can somehow improve over time.
Well, thank you, Eric, so much for coming on my show. Is there what can people do to sort of follow you? Where can they find you? How can they contribute to what you're working on?
Well, you can find me on Twitter at Eric_Lombrozo. You can go to our company's website, cypherx.com. You can go to the bitcoincore.org website to look up what's going on there. Go to the GitHub repo for Bitcoin if you want to actually contribute code and like sign up for the mailing list and the IRC channels. I mean, I guess. Yeah, if people want to talk to me, I'm usually following my Twitter, and that's an easy way to get a hold of me. And I think that I try to make myself as accessible as I can. If anyone has any serious concerns or questions or whatever, I mean, I'm available. So yeah.
All right. Thank you. And that's a great way to summarize what's going on. All right. I think we could go off the air now.
Thanks so much, Jimmy, for having me on.
Yeah, no, thank you. That is actually like a really fun conversation. Tone didn't press finish yet, huh?